the standard changes our perspective of who is struggling to make ends meet, and we'll share some examples of how the standard is being used elsewhere. So in order to understand why there was the need for the self-sufficiency standard to be developed, I think it's important to start with a quick background on the official poverty measure. The official poverty measure we use today, it provides the count and is tied to income eligibility for numerous public programs. It was created back in the early 60s by Molly Oshansky of the Social Security Administration. She used findings from a 1955 survey that determined families generally spent about 1/3 of their budgets on food. She was able to price out the cost of the economy food plan. Note that this was just the cheapest food plan designed for temporary and emergency use. Once the food budget was calculated, she was able to calculate the poverty thresholds by multiplying the food budget by 3. Other than updates for inflation, the methodology for the official poverty measure has stayed relatively unchanged since then. Molly Oshansky presented the poverty thresholds as a measure of income inadequacy, not of income adequacy. Ultimately, the official poverty measure is a measure of how much is too little and does not provide workforce programs, for example, with a useful measure of how much families really need to meet basic needs. Overall, the poverty measure is simply outdated and too low. For example, it relies on a demographic model of a 2-parent family with a stay-at-home wife. While a lot of parents are unexpectedly out of the workforce right now due to the pandemic, paid employment is the norm in our society now. By accounting for the cost of food, the poverty measure does not reflect that childcare is now a substantial part of the budget for families with young children. And with the exception of Alaska and Hawaii, the poverty measure also fails to reflect the geographic differences in the cost of living throughout the United States, as well as within a state. This is a big limitation. For example, one of the largest budget items, housing, rent that's paid, it's 4 times as much in the most expensive areas compared to the least expensive areas of the United States. The poverty measure is now just a statistical yardstick, with even many federal programs using multiples of it for program eligibility. For example, in Washington, households are eligible for basic food with gross incomes up to 200% of the poverty guidelines. Once families go over that income limit, they lose their food benefits, along with any employment and training they may have been participating in. Well, if the poverty measure is just an outdated measure of how much is not enough, how do we know how much is enough? That was the question Dr. Diana Pierce was tasked with in the 1990s as she was designing a performance measure for the goal of self-sufficiency in federal job training programs. Women were leaving the job training programs with incomes above the poverty line, but still experiencing hardships. She was tasked with creating a measure that was realistic and detailed on what working families really needed to be self-sufficient, to define a measure of income adequacy, not income inadequacy. Using a market basket approach, the standard measures the cost of all major budget items faced by working families, not just food. And finally, it's really important to note that the standard is calculated to be minimally adequate. The goal with the standard is to create the income that would be needed to meet just the basic needs without public benefits or informal assistance. You know, that would be like grandma helping out with childcare or using the use of a food pantry. This means it's a very bare bones basic needs budget. You know, it doesn't include birthday presents or any extra funds for vacations or having some pets and no soccer or music lessons. So that is my brief overview of the self-sufficiency standard approach. And with that, I am going to pass it on to Annie, who will now dive into the actual results for Washington State.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Kucklick. I am a researcher that works on the Washington State Self-Sufficiency Report for 2020, and I've been working with the Center for Women's Welfare for about a year now, doing data collection and report writing. So before we dive into the key findings from the Washington State report, I just want to do a quick interactive project and have people answer some questions that I've broached in the next 3 slides. I have 3 questions. 2 of them are multiple choice and 1 of them is open-ended. And I just ask that everyone reply in the chat function. So just put to everyone and then reply, and then I'll kind of monitor them as we start walking through. And this is just to get people thinking about what it actually takes for families to meet costs across Washington State. So the first question we have is, which county has an annual self-sufficiency standard of $64,053 for a family of 1 adult and 1 preschooler? And A, Clark County, B, King County South, C, Spokane County, or D, Snohomish County West? Oh, lots of B's. Thank you for participating, everyone. Okay, got some C, D, B, D, C. Thank you. Looks like we have a lot of participation, kind of a lot of B, King County South, some C. I'll give it 5 more seconds for people to guess. Looks like Angela says B. Okay. So the answer actually is, for those of you who guessed D, Snohomish County West, the annual self-sufficiency standard for a family of 1 adult and 1 preschooler is about $64,000. And I've also included the self-sufficiency standard. So those of you who said B, King County, were very close, but it looks like about $42,000 for Spokane County and $55,000 for Clark County. So thank you for your participation there. The next question is, how much does childcare cost per month for an infant and preschooler in King County? Is it A, $972, B, $1,468, C, $2,518, or D, $3,151? Okay, lots of C's, D's. Looks like there's a pretty solid mix, kind of more tending to C's and B's. Okay, give it a couple more seconds here. Thank you for participating there. Looks like C. Okay, a couple more seconds. So the answer is actually D, $3,151 per month, which is an incredible burden, as you can imagine, for families in the city of Seattle and in King County. Yeah. So the third question that I have is open-ended, and this is just to get people thinking about costs versus earnings in around Washington State. So the question is, average statewide costs have increased by what percentage, while median earnings increased by 60% over the last 19 years? So just write in what you're thinking. You can think about this. Do you think that costs are increasing at a faster rate than earnings? Do you think that costs are increasing at a lower rate than earnings? Think about what you were paying for housing 20 years ago. And just think about it from that perspective. So it looks like, okay, 200% from Julian, 150, 175, 112, 135, thank you, 150, 300. So lots of large numbers. So people are sounds like people are thinking that costs are increasing faster than earnings. Thank you. I'll give it a couple more seconds. Too much? Yeah. Okay, so actually the answer is 72. So on average, and this is across the state. So a lot of the people who are answering these high numbers, maybe you are thinking about specific counties that are west of the mountains, like King County and some of these places that are experiencing really burdensome housing costs that are increasing at a fast rate. So the answer is 72% median earnings have increased by 60%. So there is still this gap for families who are not experiencing the same level of wage growth that costs are growing. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to dive in now to the key findings. Hopefully this framing gives you some interest and gives you some opportunity to think about the next section for Washington State and for families who are facing the costs of living in our wonderful area. So this slide depicts 4 different counties across the state of Washington. It illustrates 2 different family types, an adult and then an adult with a preschooler and school-age child. I've chosen Grays Harbor, King County in the city of Seattle, Skagit County, and Spokane County. And you'll notice that Grays Harbor County has the lowest self-sufficiency standard, with Spokane County being very close behind for one adult. And then the highest, most expensive cost is King County in the city of Seattle, which is coming in at about $36,000. And, you know, as Lisa mentioned, these are very basic needs budgets, not including for things like dining out. So keeping that in mind, but also noticing that these costs are growing dramatically when you're growing your family. So when that adult now has a preschooler and school-age child, the costs are more than doubling in every example of every county that I've offered here. And that's partially due to, increase, now they have childcare that they're having to deal with, and a larger housing unit, which increases expenses. So the next slide, I'm just going to briefly kind of talk through, we've talked a little bit about, across the county, different counties, we've talked about the self-sufficiency standard and what the context is, but now I want to show you what our sources are for each one of the components that go into the cost of the self-sufficiency standard, starting with housing. So the housing costs that we come up with are defined by the fair market rents that are calculated annually by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They include utilities, but do not include things like internet, telephone, cable. Generally, these fair market rents are set at the 40th percentile, meaning that about 40% of housing in a given area is less expensive than the fair market rent. And this reflects a standard level of decency. And housing costs for the most part tend to be the highest, childcare close behind. So the childcare that we calculate for this standard includes the expense of full-time care for infants and preschoolers, and it includes part-time before and after school care for school-aged children. We determine this cost from state market rate surveys on the cost of childcare. These are published typically every 2 to 3 years. And we define the childcare costs based on the 75th percentile. The next cost, food. Food assumes the cost of nutritious meals prepared at home by the USDA low-cost food plan. This food cost is not allowed for any takeout or restaurant meals. If you think about a single adult with a $271 food budget, and you try to think about the last time that you went and maybe grabbed a coffee and like a scone or a treat, and we're looking at about $9 a day for food costs here. When was the last time that going and grabbing a coffee was like less than that amount? So really bare bones budget, really thinking about the bare minimum that a single adult or a family needs to feed their family nutritious meals. The next cost that we have is transportation, and we have two methodologies for determining the transportation costs in a given county. The first is considering public transportation. So if 7% or more of workers use public transportation in that county, we assume that most likely low-wage workers are using public transportation as the form of getting to and from work and childcare. So for example, King County, Seattle, because more than 7% of the population in King County use public transportation, we're assuming the cost is a monthly bus pass for the city of Seattle or King County buses. The second calculation for transportation is if that threshold is below 7% for the county, we look at the cost of owning and operating a car. And we limit the travel to work and to daycare plus about one shopping trip a week. The next cost is healthcare, and this assumes that the expenses are taken care of, or assumes that the expenses of employer-sponsored health insurance. So we are assuming that people are working and their employer is covering, they're getting insurance through their employer. So healthcare premiums and out-of-pocket costs are determined from the medical expenditure panel survey, and then a county index is calculated by us from rates from the benchmark plan via the state marketplace. Miscellaneous costs include things like clothing, shoes, personal hygiene products, telephone service, and these are calculated by taking 10% of all the other costs. So finally, for the top part of here, that we also calculate taxes, and we calculate federal income tax, payroll taxes, state and local taxes where they're applicable. We also add in tax credits in the standard, and those include the federal earned income tax credit, childcare tax credit, and the child tax credit. And then below here, you'll see that we come up with these three, the hourly, monthly, and annual self-sufficiency rate based on the input of all these different cost components. We also come up with the emergency savings fund, which is the last line. And this is the amount needed to cover living expenses when there's job loss, net of the amount expected to be received in unemployment benefits. And this was obviously calculated prior to the COVID pandemic, which has really shifted the context around unemployment and benefits that are associated with that. So there will be more research to be had once we start getting the data from unemployment from COVID. And I should say this is for Snohomish County West. So these are the costs for these family types in Snohomish County West. So this next slide further illustrates the variation of the self-sufficiency standard across the state of Washington. You'll notice that some of these counties here on the east side tend to have smaller self-sufficiency wages by the hour, whereas the west of the mountains, you're seeing more expensive regions. We have these basic needs ranging from $16.12 in Lincoln County per hour for one adult with one preschooler to $37.59 per hour in King County for this same family type of one adult and one preschooler. As Lisa mentioned, we've been really lucky to work with the Washington Workforce Development Council of Seattle, King County. This is our 7th time calculating the data, so we have some historical context that we're able to present in our reports. So this county map depicts the percentage change in time over costs from the last 20 years for a family of 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child. So over the last 19 or 20 years, the self-sufficiency standard for this 4-person family has increased on average across Washington state by 72%, which is about an annual average of 3.8% per year. There is considerable variation by county, as you can see, ranging from 49% in Benton County, excluding the cities of Kennewick and Richland, to about 112% in Seattle King County, where the cost increased by about $2,400 per year. So you'll see predominantly the same patterns as the self-sufficiency wages per hour. You'll see less growth in the same rapid pace on the east side of the mountains, with some aberrations from that pattern, including Walla Walla, Klickitat, Skamania. Some of those are seeing above average housing cost growths, which is really pushing that percentage increase over time. So just to go back and kind of talk about the official poverty measure and how the self-sufficiency standard compares with the official poverty measure. The standard focuses on calculating all of the costs of a family, not just food like the official poverty measure does. So to further demonstrate this inadequacy of the official poverty measure, the figure shows the range of costs that go into making a family's budget. And this is depicted for a family of 2 adults, 1 infant, and 1 preschooler in Yakima County. And as you can see, food is only taking up about 13% of the family's budget, compared to this 33% that's indicated in the federal poverty measure. For this family in Yakima, housing and childcare take up more than 50% of their budget. And this is fairly typical for families across the country. We see that families with young children are dedicating more than 50% of their basic budget to the cost of childcare and housing. In our analysis, we also look at wages and minimum wage, and we compare that with what it takes to meet basic needs in various counties. So this depiction shows a Thurston County adult who has a preschooler and school-age child. That adult needs to make $56,000, $279 per year in order to meet their basic needs. And if that adult is working a full-time minimum wage job, they are looking at a wage inadequacy of over $21,000 a year. If that adult worked almost 2 full-time jobs, 79 hours per week, then they would be able to meet their basic needs. But that's more than 2 full-time jobs for a parent of 1 preschooler and 1 school-age child in Thurston County. So now that we've gone through and we've detailed the cost of meeting basic needs in Washington State, the next question that we face is how families can secure the resources necessary to meet their basic needs. And to answer this question, we start to analyze the wages from the top 10 occupations in 2 locations in Washington State. And this first graph focuses on the region of Seattle. We have the top 10 occupations in the region of Seattle listed here on the left side. And then we have this dotted orange line here indicating the self-sufficiency wage for Seattle-King County for a family of 1 adult, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child, which requires $38.85 per hour in order to meet their basic needs. So you're seeing that 3 occupations do meet the needs of this family, that of registered nurses, software developers, general and operations managers. But then on the other side of that, you're seeing almost 50% of these top 10 occupations, almost 50% of the workers are making wages in their occupation that are less than 50% of what they need to get by. So it's very unique to see this polarization occurring in these top 10 occupations analysis. Typically across the country, you're not seeing these extremely high wages on one side and then these extremely low wages on the other side. So it is important to, you're seeing maybe some of that in somewhere like Denver, but this is fairly unique to the city of Seattle. This also includes retail salesperson. So this is the most common occupation in the region, and making $18.71 per hour. That's only 48% of the standard for that family type in the city of Seattle. So moving along to this next representation, we've looked at the Kennewick-Richland region, and We chose the Kennewick-Richland self-sufficiency wage of $25.74 per hour for one adult, one preschooler, and one school-aged child, because that's close to the median for across the state of Washington for this family type, $25.74. So this figure can be fairly representative of what's happening in other places across Washington state. So it's again showing the top 10 occupations. You're not seeing that same polarization of wages quite as much as we did in Seattle. There's only one wage that's actually making, that's actually allowing for this family to meet the cost of living. Again, you have retail salespersons as the top occupation. These 10 occupations make up 22% of Kennewick-Richland's workforce in that top 10 occupations bracket. So again, this top occupation is only making about 58% of what they need in order to get by in the Kennewick-Richland region. So there are two strategies to getting families to self-sufficiency. You can reduce costs and you can raise incomes. For many low-income families, public assistance for necessities such as childcare, healthcare, and housing are sometimes the only means to meet their basic needs. However, if we're going to get families to long-term self-sufficiency, this really requires the ability of families to meet basic needs without any public or private assistance. And ultimately, like closing that wage gap will require public policies that increase education and training. It will support asset building, and it'll ultimately make work pay enough to meet the costs of basic needs. So this final figure that I'll show you here depicts a wage adequacy graph. So this is depicting a family of one adult and one preschooler and one school-aged child in Kitsap County who require a hourly wage of $29.44 per hour in order to meet 100% of their costs. And you'll notice that that line interacts with this 100% wage adequacy. So you're looking at $29.44 here. And I'm going to discuss this figure from the perspective of someone working minimum wage. So each of these lines represents a different wage that are pretty common across the state of Washington. But if someone is working $13.50 per hour and they're supporting a preschooler and a school-aged child, they're really only making 48% of their family's basic needs if they're living in Kitsap County in the North region. However, if we're able to add childcare assistance to that, it increases their wage adequacy to 67%. And then on top of that, if you're able to add food and healthcare assistance, you're increasing that to almost 80% of wage adequacy. And finally, if you do receive housing assistance, that family is now able to cover 100% of their basic needs. Now, we can't really talk about this graph without acknowledging that there is this large looming cliff that you see here at about $22. So this means that as soon as those families or that adult who is supporting their preschooler and school-aged child is reaching $22 an hour, they're losing eligibility for these helpful work supports or public assistance, and they're dropping about 20% in their ability or their wage adequacy to cover their basic needs. And those don't recover until they meet that around that $28, $29 per hour self-sufficiency wage. So that concludes my section of the key findings. I know that I've gone through a lot of information here. So I wanted to open up and allow people to ask some questions in the chat function. I think Shalane has been monitoring to see if there's any questions that were coming up, but please feel free to ask some questions. We've gone over a lot of information here, so we are happy, Lisa and I are happy to provide some responses for you. And Shalane, I'll let you take over the mic here for a little bit, since you're going to be discussing the next section as well.
Thank you, Annie. So everybody was very quiet in the chat. I think they were very absorbed with all the facts and great figures coming their way. Was there anything that surprised you? And this is a question to all participants on the call as Annie went through the presentation. Still a lot of silence there. I'll give a couple more minutes for folks to add questions in there. All right, it looks like there's a question from Sean Morin. Do other states that have a self-sufficiency standard also use the same inputs, and do any of them do it differently?
I'll take that question. We try to be standardized as possible in our methodology across the states. So we do use the same inputs for the most part. There's a couple really small little variations, like in New York City, we incorporate the census New York City housing vacancy survey into the housing costs. In California, the state used to do the reimbursement levels at the 85th percentile of the child care market rate survey. And that was the data that they put out there as what they reimbursed at as kind of adequate child care costs. So we adopted that level as well. But for the most part, we try to keep things as consistent as possible using the same national data sets when we're able. Child care costs is one of those things that are the most differentiated by state, as each state has a little bit more control, individualism in how they do their market rate surveys.
A couple other notations in the chat. There were some people that said it was very surprising that there were so few occupations that reached the self-sufficiency level. And then also someone found it surprising that there was such a large gap between the self-sufficiency calculation and the federal poverty measure. There's another question as well from Tim from ESD. Is there an analysis showing the number of jobs in Washington that pay less than a self-sufficiency wage? And can this help us understand structural poverty?
Yeah, we don't have that analysis for Washington state specifically. We have done that in other states when we do our demographic analysis, which I'll be talking about shortly, where we're able to benchmark households with their self-sufficiency standard to census data. And then we're able to look at which occupations those households are in. So for households in jobs that have earnings below the self-sufficiency wage, how many households are there? What are the different demographic characteristics of those households? But that's an analysis we unfortunately haven't done for Washington yet.
And Tim, I'll get into this a little bit more as I go through the self-sufficiency calculator, but in Seattle-King County, for those who are enrolled in the WIOA workforce programs, those individuals are tracked within our database so that we can measure self-sufficiency. Because while we're looking at this picture and different family types, until you know what family types are working in which occupations, there's a little bit less that we're guessing at, right? There's another question in the chat. Has this tool had any direct policy impacts?
Sure, lots. The standard is used quite a bit for policy analysis. So in several states we've done, the wage adequacy chart that Annie just showed you is a great example of things we've done in other states to look at, for example, where the childcare cliffs are, or if there's certain like big jumps in the childcare, and how the state's specific co-payment schedule impacts families. So with those sort of analysis, some states have done policy legislation to change the way those structures were set up. Same with EITC. Washington state doesn't have an earned income tax credit, but in other states with state income taxes, the self-sufficiency standard has been used a lot to advocate for expanded state EITC. Example in Washington, in Oregon to the south, the self-sufficiency standard was used to come up with those 3 tiers for their minimum wage. So those are some examples.
I also see a question in the chat that I'm not quite sure if it's clear, but I'll read it. What does that mean for the cost of public support to our economy? And it may be related to the earlier question around so few occupations reaching self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I think that, right now we have a lot of people who don't have jobs to go back to. And there's a big question about what is the policy response to that, and how do we help those households? And using the self-sufficiency standard can be a tool for looking at that.
Great. And then the last question here is there any current legislation going to the Hill that'll address the inadequate federal poverty level?
I'll take that one too. No. Efforts to change the poverty level have been just on hold for the last, for a period of time. So early in the Obama administration, there was legislation that included a calculation of the self-sufficiency standard at a federal level. And that was included with the calculation of the supplemental poverty measure, which is another way that the census is now looking at poverty, and that's a whole nother webinar. But with that legislation, the Obama administration ended up funding the supplemental poverty measure, which essentially just meant that the legislation died, as the main portion of it got the funding. And since then, the capacity to push for something like this hasn't really been there. And kind of everything's kind of paused with the current administration, and we'll see what happens in the future.
Great, thank you. So with that, I will go ahead and go into my piece of this presentation. So the Self-Sufficiency Calculator is a tool that is sponsored by the Seattle-King County, WDC. As both Lisa and Annie mentioned, we have partnered with them since 2007, which has been a long time that the calculator has been in place. And that came from support from local workforce councils across the state, as well as funding from the Paul Allen Family Foundation and the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. So there was a lot of energy at that time, and it was launched. Also, it's updated not every year, but every several years, and there are a number of workforce development councils across the state that also co-invest in that process. The next thing I wanted to say, in terms of how we use this calculator in King County, there are a number, and Annie, you can go to the next slide. So in King County, it's currently used in our workforce locations throughout the county. In WIOA, employment case managers use it together with customers as a career planning tool. So the standard helps customers to target occupations and job training to meet their economic needs. And what it also does is it helps to set some benchmarks and goals and measure progress for folks. You can go on to thecalculator.org, and anyone can use this as a tool. You don't have to be in King County. You can be in any part of the state. It could be even outside of the state, but the data is relevant to our state. And when someone goes into this, this is a screenshot of what they see. So by entering simply the family composition and the ages of those that are in the household, it will generate a standard wage, the self-sufficiency standard. That's general. But then what someone is able to do is go in and change different pieces of it so that it aligns with their expenses. So it goes into housing, childcare, transportation, a number of things. So it allows a participant to adjust that. If they have their mother-in-law watching their children and they do not have to pay for that cost, then they can enter 0 in that area. So it allows for a lot of flexibility, which I think is great. It helps people to understand, when I finish training, am I going to be able to pay rent? Am I going to be able to pay my expenses? It will also help people to see what different types of public assistance they could qualify for if they're not already accessing that. And we talked about it a little bit in the other part of the presentation, but what this tool does is it shows income adequacy. So it does show what you need to earn without any public support to meet your very basic expenses. But the other thing that it does is it shows if you are receiving public assistance, where is that point where with that public assistance, you're able to meet your expenses. So anyway, it shows a couple of different scenarios, and it's a really great tool. Another thing that we do for the Seattle King County WDC is we measure poverty and progress within these programs by pulling data every year to show the progress that customers have made towards self-sufficiency. So again, this is the adult and dislocated worker programs that are part of the WIOA, which is Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act. It's one of the largest programs that we implement here in this area. So if you take a look at both graphs, on the left side, you'll see at program entry. And so what this shows is it shows where someone is at when they enter the program. So 59% of customers, for example, fell into the bracket where they had 0 earned income. Perhaps they were recently laid off, long-term unemployed. It could really vary. And then 24% of them were at 50% of that self-sufficiency wage. So perhaps they were working but wanted to get a better job. And then 18% of those were over that 50% of self-sufficiency wage threshold. And then what you can see on the right-hand side is the progress and where that participant was at program exit. So you see that 36% of those that exited the program were at less than 71% self-sufficiency. Now, we saw the wages, and so even though someone is not quite at that self-sufficiency range, I want to point out that there's a dramatic increase there. So it's already bettered that person's situation. So it could have been completion of training. It could have been getting a job in a better field. It could be many reasons, but there's an increase in income overall. Then you see 16% are over 71% of self-sufficiency, and then 49% exit the programs at full self-sufficiency. So I want to pause right there for a moment And I want to recognize a couple things. One, how hard this work is, but also the progress that we see with the talented providers that we subcontract with and all of those really dedicated workforce professionals that are operating in the workforce locations, and the possibility of progress that exists, because I think there's a lot of heavy information in here about how much it takes, but I do want to highlight there's a lot of progress there. I'm going to pass it back to our presenters here to talk a little more about the standard.
Great. Thank you so much, Shalane. So I want to provide some other examples about when we use the standard instead of the poverty measure, what difference it can make in our understanding of how many households are struggling to meet basic needs. We don't have current data for Washington State, but I thought it would be helpful to look at historical data to demonstrate how using the standard can give us a bit of a different perspective of how many and which households lack adequate income. The next couple of slides are based on some analysis we've done in the past using census data, specifically the 2000 census, along with the 2007 and 2013 American Community Survey data. Our analysis crosswalks a household's income in the census with their self-sufficiency standard annual income level. And it's based on, looks at where they live, the number of people in the household, the ages of the children. And before I share some findings, I just want to note that this data only includes adults presumed to be in the workforce or presumed to be able to be in the workforce, meaning that these charts do exclude seniors and adults with work-limiting disabilities. So first, let's take a look at what we saw after the Great Recession. You can see that the percentage of households with inadequate income according to the poverty measure and the standard stayed pretty consistent between 2000 and 2007. The Great Recession then hit at the end of 2007. And while it was supposed to technically be over in 2009, you can see that recovery was ongoing and the impact was still being felt in 2013. So while the official poverty measure only showed an increase of 3 percentage points over the Great Recession, the percentage of households below the standard increased by 9 percentage points. This suggests to us that families with high rates of income inadequacy going into an economic downturn, single mothers, women, people of color, they'll be more vulnerable to the pandemic-related economic shutdowns and the high levels of job losses that we are unfortunately currently seeing. Using the standard over the poverty measure also highlights that families with children are particularly at a high risk for lacking enough income. While there is an 8% difference between the poverty rate and the self-sufficiency standard estimate for households with no children, by not accounting for the cost of child care, the poverty measure underestimates by 35% the income inadequacy rate for households with young children. So likewise, if we look specifically at the households with incomes that we've estimated to be below the standard in 2013, we find that any stereotypical assumption around who's poor are just simply wrong. Nearly 60% of households are households with children, 60% have at least some college, 83% have at least one worker, many two workers in the household, and 95% receive no public assistance. So I just have one final data point that I want to highlight before we wrap up. So this last slide highlights that in 2013, Western Washington particularly surrounding Seattle, was generally about twice as expensive as Eastern Washington. But the proportion of households with inadequate income was quite a bit higher east of the mountains. We know the spread in the cost of living between the West and the East has increased since 2013, but we don't yet have the data to know what impact that has had in households, in the difference in households with inadequate income since then. So we know that in Seattle, this region over here, we have so many tech workers and workers in general that are just more insulated from pandemic job loss through their ability to work from home, which is probably creating quite a bit of disparity between the East and the West. And we hope to eventually be able to have data to take a look at that. So we are just about out of time, but I want to note that the Self-Sufficiency Standard is more than just a bunch of data points. It is a tool. It's used, in WC, in workforce, by training programs, by program managers to evaluate program effectiveness. It's used a lot by different communities for, as a community indicator of the cost of living at a basic needs level. Also, policymakers and legislators use it to seek, to create programs that lead to self-sufficiency for working families. A couple specific examples would be, for example, like the Women's Foundation of Southern Arizona. They're using the Self-Sufficiency Standard right now as an eligibility threshold for COVID-19 grants. So those are going to households that didn't receive any federal funding, federal recovery funding, and then they're using the Self-Sufficiency Standard as the income eligibility threshold to kind of help those households that have been left out, that are on the margin and in risk. Another state that is doing similar work as WDC is Wisconsin. Wisconsin, the state Department of Workforce Development, is using the standard specifically in a similar way. And just lastly, I wanted to note that in Oregon, WDC also helped their Portland peers at Work Systems Inc. with the development of the prosperity calculator. And that was modeled after the one in Washington. And there's so many other examples, but we are at our 2 o'clock endpoint. So just pass it along to Shalane if there's any other final statements or questions.
Yeah, so really quick here, just want to thank everyone for your participation. I will be sending out a survey to everyone that was on the call today and those who could not make it. And then lastly, you can take a look here at this website, selfsufficiency.org, and you can look at the full report, which has a ton of great information from the entire state. So I encourage you to check it out, and I will wrap it up there. Thank you to our presenters and everyone on the call.